Good morning, Ice Nation. Hey, it's RJ here, live out in Las Vegas, and excited to jump on some vestibular stuff with you again early this morning. It's been a little bit since I was last on, but I wanted to just kind of reiterate a lot of things that the team was saying in the ice sampler here in Las Vegas. Was an amazing weekend, and excited to say that we'll be hosting it again next year. So definitely, if you've got that opportunity to come out and join us, please do so. We're going to jump into some content today, and then I'll finish up with some of the opportunities to get involved with ice here going forward. But I just happened to get a really cool case that I think will segue into some of what my plans for today's episode was, and hopefully will be something that we could talk about over the next couple episodes that I do here in the future. And that is, I got an unclear case that walked in that I actively am still working through, and I'll have a follow-up visit scheduled for later today. So just a quick case history, and this is one of the things where I always try to have a bit of humble humility working in a vestibular setting where we get some obscure kind of vague symptoms that this patient's been passed around the medical system for a little bit, and the hope is we're the group that's going to fix them, because so far nothing else has really worked, and dizziness is a major factor for them. And so it's kind of throwing the Hail Mary and saying, hey, these guys might be the people that figure it out and fix it, because it seems to have, we've checked off a lot of the other boxes. And unfortunately, the testing that we did early on didn't necessarily reveal a clear-cut vestibular disorder. So now we're actively working through some of this. So the patient has had symptoms for several months now. We're going a little over half a year. And the symptoms seem to come and go spontaneously. When we talk about some of the symptom behavior model that we'll look at in my course, there doesn't seem to be noted triggers that we tend to like for a nice clean path into a diagnosis. She at this point can't identify whether it's certain movements or positions or activities or stressors that make her symptoms worse. There's days that she feels really bad. There's days where she feels like she has no symptoms at all. They could last for very, very short durations. They could last for a majority of the day. So we sat down, and I should also include that like the type of symptoms that she's experiencing are not necessarily like true spinning. They're a little bit more ambiguous. They're a little more unsteady, off balance, lightheaded, fogginess, things that aren't quite clean. And she has a relevant history that she wanted to include in her story of being in two meaningful motor vehicle accidents. But they were about 10-15 years ago, and she was taken to the hospital at one point in which they thought she had a pretty aggressive migraine attack, because other things did not test out in that sense. So when she sat down, after going through some of the case history, we went through some quick bedside screening things, looking at ocular motility. How do her eyes move around? Do I see any oculomotor dysfunction patterns that we would pick up with some central nervous system related issues? Does she seem like when I ever switch between targets, does that worsen her symptoms, or does she consistently undershoot? Does she have any unclear tracking with her visual system? And a lot of that stuff tested out okay. Then we moved on to some dynamic head movement where I had her shaking her head, looking at targets, and that seemed to actually make her symptoms a little bit worse. So now I'm getting excited in the sense that I have at least one asterisk sign that I can look at and monitor and go, hey, this changes, and it changes in a way that that matches some symptom patterns. Then we go into positional testing. I lay her down, and we don't see any nystagmus in any position. So I can start to take positional vertigo off as a leading hypothesis for why she's feeling the way that she's feeling. And then we hopped up and we did some postural balance testing, and she looks really solid on all of that stuff. So I don't have really strong legs at the moment to stand on for a winning answer. So then I go into some cervical related pieces, knowing that she has the motor vehicle related history. She complains of neck pain, and the reason she actually found our clinic was through another physical therapist that was consulting with her over some cervical related symptoms. So we dive in, and I use some of the tools that I've picked up from Jeff and Justin's courses on the spine management. And as we start digging into some of her neck stuff, we're immediately lighting her symptoms up with neck related complaints, not so much dizziness related complaints. But there's something there. And then we go into our cervical flexion rotation test, and she's actually pretty poor in both directions. So I'm keeping cervical on board at this point as a possible cervicogenic dizziness related complaint, but it's not necessarily a horse that is winning the race for me at this time. I fortunately am in a practice where I have the opportunity to sometimes call on an audiologist to do some immediate testing, and the audiologist was available at this time. So I said, hey, could we get a V&G done, which a V&G is one of the gold standard tests for vestibular function, and the audiologist was available. We got it all worked out. We sent her in for that testing, and she pretty much passes that test with flying colors. So we get a deep dive into some central findings, and central findings look clear. We get a deep dive into looking at unilateral dysfunction through some caloric issues. Calorics come up clear. We get some peripheral, just general system dysfunction. All of that stuff comes up clear. So the audiologist kind of finishes this test and says, if it is vestibular in nature, I'm not picking it up on my test. So the patient's been in the office now for a good little bit with us. I decide to just get her scheduled for today so we can follow up, so we don't just keep hammering away at her. And my plans today, and this is the dynamic piece, and this is where some of what my original plan for today's conversation was meant to be at, is this V&G is a really great test to look at vestibular dysfunction, but there's a lot of it that is a rather static test. And the thing from all of my exam that really only teased out any major complaints related to her primary complaint was the dynamic head moving part of the test. And so I've got to do some more due diligence in stressing her system in a dynamic way to see maybe she's a younger gal, she's in her 40s. Maybe what we're looking at here is a vestibular dysfunction that needs some dynamic stress to really bring it out in the clinic. Or I think where my leading hypothesis is at this time is really migraine related vestibular dysfunction. And so the tricky part with that is we've got to look at a couple migraine related things to see if she really falls into those categories. And then she may be a person that responds well to migraine related medication management, and that may be the thing that takes her symptoms into a manageable pathway for her going forward. And she may not do great with just straight vestibular rehab without that on board. But we're also going to look at some cervical related things. So she's going to be an interesting case to hopefully report some positive responses here over the next few weeks on episodes that I jump on in the future. But what I wanted to talk about on today's episode was the dynamic piece to vestibular function, and looking at the VOR system. So our last major episode that I was on with you guys, we were looking at postural dysfunction and talking about the SOT test, where we have the patient in a machine that you're standing on a force plate and things are moving around and the floor moves and the walls move with eyes open and eyes closed, and how does that present out postural imbalance and postural sway, versus now we're going to look at the vestibular ocular reflexive system and the VOR system. What does that mean for our gaze stability as our head's moving? Because that's a whole other subset of symptoms that we can see from some vestibular dysfunction. So the classic test that we can use with this is literally having an eye chart and getting a metronome out, sitting the patient up at the eye chart, getting a baseline static visual acuity, and then having them actively move their head and seeing how that changes. And so what we're looking at here is say we're going to take the yaw direction, which is me turning my head left and right here, side to side. I'm going to sit the patient down. I'm going to have the chart a fixed distance away from them, and I'm going to figure out what line on that eye chart can they get to without any stress to the system. What's their current acuity level visually? And let's say it's line 6 on the eye chart. Now we get the head moving and we're going side to side in that yaw motion. The VOR system has to drive some visual stability for them to be able to continue to accurately read letters off the eye chart. Now, we should also appreciate that their eyes aren't going to stay perfectly clear, moving versus still. So there's going to be some deviation on that chart. But we need to know what our thresholds are for the chart that we have set up for where they're going to drop down. And with that, we can start to see some dynamic dysfunction. And so if we're seeing a significant drop off from what line they can read with their head still versus their head moving, we could start to relate that to some potential inner ear weakness that is not allowing them to maintain visual stability with their head in motion. We can do the same thing. We can change the way that we're moving our head. And there's a really cool way with the same balance machine we were talking about on the last vestibular episode, that the computer screen will flash objects for them to recognize. And they're wearing a headset, and the headset will register the speed that their head is moving, and it will flash the letters only for a brief moment. So this really keeps the patient honest and can really dive into some specifics. And this is a great way to measure another system that could be related to the patient's vestibular dysfunction without having a great means to test it with a bunch of fancy equipment. So you could get an eye chart, paste it on the wall, set up a fixed distance that you know you're going to keep consistent, get a metronome that you're going to keep a standard time for the cases that you're seeing, and now you have a repeatable objective measure to do that on the other end of the spectrum of having a lot of fancy equipment that you can use to test in that sense. And now we're going to watch, hey, how does this change and how does this mimic the patient's symptoms? So let's say we start having vestibular complaints that come out on board with that. We see a measurable weakness, and that becomes a goal for something that we're going to work on with therapy. So we're going to use gaze stability exercises or some sort of vestibular ocular reflex training in our clinic. The easiest things to do is to just start to mimic that for patients at home, giving them a target on the wall. I always tell my patients there's tons of free metronome apps on whether you're on Apple or Android or whatever phone platform that you have. You go into your app store, purchase a free metronome, and now this becomes a repeatable and measurable system for them. And whether you want to give them like an arm's length, put a sticker on the wall, put a card up there on the wall, and you set your metronome and do durations of exercise where we're working towards a symptomatic threshold. And for what I like to use a lot with my patients is we're looking for about 1 minute where we don't necessarily set the system off and we go and they get extremely symptomatic from the exercise. But we also don't want it to be too easy, because we need some sort of challenge to stimulate the system to start to move forward here. And so we set it down. We've got our minute timer going. We've got the metronome going, and they're working to just maintain clarity of that object while they're sitting there. And we can start to progress this easily in some different ways, where we go from, sitting to standing, from standing to maybe standing on one leg, or a more challenging stance, or standing on a compliant surface, something squishy that's going to test their postural balance while they're on it, actually getting up and moving while they do it. You'll see this large progression of options here, even all the way up to getting the target moving while you are also moving your head. And usually that's performed in opposite patterns. So if I were to kind of demonstrate here, as my thumb moves left in reference to me, my head is moving right in reference back to that starting position, and then vice versa. And now we've got a target in motion and my head in motion, and we call that VOR times 2 training. So VOR times 1, the target stays fixed and my head is moving. VOR times 2, the target's moving and my head are moving. So we have 2 objects in motion. And then a lot of times you'll see things like VOR times 0 or VOR times C, which is a term called VOR cancellation, in which the target and my head are moving in sequence with each other. And why we call it cancellation or times 0 is in relative respect to my visual setup with my eyes and the target that I have. There's no real change in position. They should be linked, and my eyes are actually going to stay fixed on that rather than reflexively move like they normally would in a VOR times 1. So if I stay here, my eyes are actually kind of contacting the edges of my ocular range to the left and to the right. When I go to VOR times C, my eyes stay fixed in the center of the orbit and they move with the target. So I'm basically actively overriding that reflex to see how well can I suppress or override that response, and does that bring out symptoms? What happens and what I get when I do that is the background information behind the target becomes very noisy for my system to pick up, and that could be a major driver of some symptom complaints as well. So those are some really quick, simple VOR strategies to test out some dysfunction and to begin treating that dysfunction. And we hopefully will have some positive news on my case study that we just started the other day in the office. And real quick, I just want to sign off with some opportunities to meet up with the ICE team coming up here soon. First is the 2 dizziness courses that we've got on the calendar at the moment for the end of this year and the beginning of next year. If you want to do some more vestibular stuff with me, it's going to be in September up in Oregon, and then at the turn of the new year in 2019 in Colorado. So both of those should be a great time. Those are the ones on the calendar now if you want to plan for those. Things that we've got going up, I've got some notes here on my computer. We've got Jessica in Georgia, Mitch and Ryan doing another fitness athlete course, and Justin's going to be in Minneapolis for his spinal thrust. Those are all closing down April. And Eric also doing his extremity management symptoms. Also with Eric is coming to Vegas here in July, so if you missed that one, we've got another one coming right around the corner. Jessica's also going to be doing C-spine management again in May. Jason has got a course in May, and we should have a persistent pain online course here starting soon as well. So if you want to get connected with the ICE team in one of our live sessions or even our online course, go ahead and head over to our website at ptonice.com. Check out all the things that we've got there. Something good is coming up in your area, I'm sure, or something that's not too far away for you to get to. Nothing like going to a live course with this team. We've got a great group, and it's always a killer weekend to get a quick level up of your skills in. So thanks for joining me this morning, and we will catch you guys here on the next episode. Have a good one.